Hey there, Eli coming at you again in front of the plant system today at OSA Coventry, here to talk a little bit about marginal plants. Now, a couple of me and my coworkers were just marveling at how lovely these monstera plants are looking behind us, and there are a handful of different marginal plants that we actually have growing out of the top of this tank. We are blessed that this tank has such a large surface area that we're kind of able to play around with things like this. Makes a really cool addition to the room. But I wanted to talk a little bit about adding marginal plants or plants that come above the waterline in your aquarium to your aquarium, and maybe some of the benefits that those have going for them. So this tank behind me, again, has a couple philodendrons. It's got monsteras in it. It's got pothos and a couple of other vining marginal plants. And what that really means, being a marginal plant, is that they can tolerate their roots being submerged in the water, or at least many of these species can. So the middle of this tank is scaped pretty sparsely, but there are some rocks, there is some driftwood, and then kind of tucked in a few different spots within this scape, we added a few of these live plants just to spice things up. In addition to looking really cool over a rimless tank, which just so happens to be the biggest craze in the hobby right now, there are some really nice additional benefits to adding these live plants above the waterline. One of the biggest things about adding marginal plants is they're going to grow so much faster than your fully aquatic plants would. And this is generally just because they have an easier time at reaching CO2, and they have an easier time pulling nutrients, nitrates, and phosphates from the water column because they have such more access to atmospheric CO2. As with stem plants, a lot of the times you have to artificially add CO2 to the water column. A lot of people get into CO2 dosing or carbon dosing in general to very high-tech planted tanks to make sure that they can fulfill the CO2 requirement for quick growth with aquatic plants. But like I mentioned, all of your riverside marginal plants can pull CO2 directly from the air. CO2 is very much more abundant in the air, especially indoors, and these plants can just grow so much faster because of that. Now, when we get into adding some of these larger plants, these faster growing plants especially, we can offer some sort of shade and some sort of cover even inside the tank as the roots start to grow. Adds a little bit of 3D features to the water column itself and offers some area for fish to hide in, especially if you're looking to breed fish. You get the 3D root structure of that plant. Then you also get a couple of spots of shading by adding plants above the tank as well. When the plants start to grow, and when they start to grow very steadily, they actually help to purify the water. So as I just mentioned, with them pulling nitrates and phosphates namely, and a handful of other nutrients, macro and micronutrients, these plants are going to help you out between water changes. So especially if you have a really well-stocked aquarium, something that's got a lot of fish, or it's got a handful of larger fish, or it's a type of fish that you feed very often, these plants are going to help pull some of those contaminants from the water column, be it ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and even your phosphates, to just help keep your water just a little bit cleaner in between water changes. Now, this is not to say that in most systems you are able to get away without water changes just by adding plants to the top. A lot of times this would require you to have a very low density stocked aquarium, or a huge amount of plants like separate grow beds on the side of the aquarium. However, this is still something that is going to help you out in the long run to make sure that your water stays clearer and stays safer for the animals that live within it. Some of our favorite types of plants to grow from the top of the tank are pothos. This is a very available vining plant, very cheap. You can get it at most of your hardware stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, and these are very tolerant of having roots entirely submerged. And they're also very easy to propagate just by cutting a section of the rhizome and allowing them to soak in the water. They generally will root pretty quickly. So not only are they really suitable to adding to the aquarium, but they're also really easy to propagate. So you have other trimmings that you can do whatever you desire with down the road. Monsteras, which are these really big, large leaf plants that you see behind me here, are also very tolerant. They're very fast growing and they seem to do very well above the tank. And there are other plants that are quite tolerant as well. Philodendrons happen to be very tolerant. Arrowhead plants are very tolerant of aquarium settings. And there are numerous other species that you can go with as well. You just may have to get creative about how you add those to your aquarium. Oftentimes we're going to scape these tanks kind of close to the surface and maybe just hide a pot somewhere within the driftwood or something like that. Or sometimes we even just clamp a pot to the back of the tank. And generally we don't use any soil in these pots, but sometimes a larger gravel or like a clay-based substrate are appropriate. And sometimes just leaving them wrapped in like mineral wool is an important way to make sure that they stay in those pots and the roots can breathe and reach the water. But overall, marginal plants are a really fun addition to most freshwater aquariums. As long as you're not running a decent salt content to the water, and as long as you have appropriate lighting in the room or above the tank to host those plants, oftentimes, as long as you have a secure way to add these plants to the aquarium, they are going to do very well for you, and they're going to add those benefits that I mentioned earlier. As always, thank you guys for tuning in. Feel free to leave questions, comments, suggestions in the comment section below. And as always, keep it fishy.